what is heaven going to be like, and how will we interact with other people in heaven? And I'd like to start out the discussion of heaven by uh, giving you an analogy. Our trying to understand heaven right now is like trying to write poetry in a language that you don't speak. Think how difficult that would be, because you just don't have the tools necessary to be able to really even start the task. And so, were it not for God telling us all these things that he has in the Bible, our speculating about heaven would be just like trying to write poetry in a language that we don't speak. Now, thankfully, God did tell us a lot about heaven. He tells us some things in the Old Testament, and then he sent to earth the one that John says, the one who came from heaven. He's the only one who's come from heaven. And so we have to believe that when he tells us what heaven is going to be like, well, that's exactly what's it's going to be like. Is number one, he's God. And number two, he knows what he's talking about because that's where he is. And that's really a pretty good definition of heaven. Heaven is where God is. Now, that leads to some interesting realizations that may be a shock if you've never thought about this before. When you talk about somebody going to heaven now when they pass away, that is not the same heaven that we're going to be in 1,000 years from now or 10,000 years from now. They are different heavens. So I'd like to introduce this concept to you. The Bible suggests to us there are three heavens. We know that the very first mention of heaven is Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But my understanding of the three heavens are that you have the atmospheric heaven that was created when God separated out the sea from the atmosphere. And so you've got that heaven, which is the ball of gas that surrounds the earth. Then you've got the second heavens, which is the cosmos. It is the outer space, that which exists in the physical realm that is outside of Earth and Earth's atmosphere. And that would include the dominion of all the stars, the galaxies, the other planets, etc. There's a third heaven, and when Paul was caught up into the third heaven, that's where God is. And so that would be a metaphysical heaven. Now, that heaven will change, and the other heavens will change too. So there's a lot of change coming with regard to heaven. And so if you think of heaven as being one static thing, this is the way it is, it's been like that forever, and it's going to be like that forever, then you're probably going to learn some new things today, because the Bible tells a different story. I'm reading now from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And it says, however, as it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him. And that verse, if you look at it by itself, would suggest a futility to trying to understand what God has prepared for us. But you have to look at the next verse also to understand this. These are the things God has revealed to us by his Spirit. So we can't, of our own physical limitations, know anything about heaven. But we can have the truth about heaven revealed to us by God. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. I'd like to start with a rather intriguing statement and see what you guys think of it. There is something that you have that's in heaven right now. Can anybody tell me what that is?
Well, I know we stored treasure in heaven. Are you referring to that?
That's exactly what I'm referring to. That Jesus tells us, and this is Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, that we should not store up for ourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But we are to instead store up for ourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. All the different things that you've done as a believer, that you've done in faith to please God, those all are treasures in heaven. And one of my very favorite teachings of all time is my teaching on forgiveness, where I explain how forgiveness is is God's plan to turn what went wrong on earth into eternal treasure for you, waiting for you in heaven. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and we're going to look at a good part of the second half of that chapter, starting with verse 35, and there's a part B to this as well. And it basically, Paul is writing here, and he says, if someone asks, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? He says, what you sow does not come to life until it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or something else. But God gives it a body as he has determined. And each kind of seed, he gives its own body. Not all flesh is the same. People have one kind of flesh, animals another, birds and fish another. There are also heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies, but the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind. The splendor of the earthly bodies is another. I continue here, the next slide. So it will be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. And then he says a little bit later in the chapter, in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. So this is a detailed discussion that Paul gives us of what is going to change when we get our ultimate glorified body, is how I would refer to it. Right now, we have an earth suit, and it's perfect for life on earth. But when we die, our body decomposes, and we're going to immediately go to heaven in the form of our soul and our spirit. Then in heaven, it is not entirely clear what God is going to do, but we know his ultimate plan for us is that we are going to be clothed again with the body that will be connected to what we were in our earthly earth suits. But the difference is going to be that we won't have any of the problems that our earth suits had, because nobody gets a body that is perfect. And even if you did, it would just wear out anyway, because these bodies are not meant to last an eternity. Your glorified body will last for an eternity. And that's really one of the things we have to look forward to, is as we age and our bodies become more and more infirm in different ways, and we have aches and pains and things that don't work right, we can look forward to that time when we will no longer be burdened with those issues. So if you have a problem with the shoulder that just doesn't work right, and you know it's never going to be better, well, that may be true here on earth, but one day it will work perfectly, and it will work perfectly forever. And we know that we will be recognizable. So we won't have to wear name tags, but we will be able to discern who it is that we're talking to. I don't think there's any earthly rule that you can point to and say that's how God is going to do it. I think that's an exercise in futility to try to figure out how this works, because the rules are all going to change. When we're with God in heaven, the heaven we're going to go to when we die, that heaven, that third heaven, that's going to have different rules. And I can't tell you what they are. I can't even imagine. If you remember 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, my mind can't even conceive of what those rules are going to be like. But I know who's going to be there. And that's really the key thing, is that it is the presence of God that causes somewhere to be heaven. Heaven is where God dwells. Now, right now, heaven is in the metaphysical realm. Now, it may also have a counterpart in the physical. I don't know. And I'd suggest that no one truly knows the answer to this. But I do believe that it does have some physicality, because we see the vision that Isaiah had in chapter 6 of his book, of the throne room of God, where these are not ethereal events that are just, somehow like an illusion. No, these are very real. There is a physicality. And so even though this may be a metaphysical place, there is a physicality to it in a way we just can't comprehend yet. And that's okay. We don't need to. When you go to heaven, you're going to be with God, and it's going to be wonderful because he's going to be there. Ultimately, that's not where you're going to stay. The Bible tells us the end of the story of man. But before I get there, let me take just a little bit more and talk about where you're going to be dwelling. This is now in the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. We'll start with that. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. This is what I was mentioning just a moment ago, where I said, if you've got any physical issues that you've had to deal with in this life, then the idea that you will be released from all of those limitations and all of those aches and pains, that's a joyous one. I'm so glad we don't have eternal life like this. How much better what God has planned for us, with a glorified body and also a soul and spirit that are in some way transformed as well. And I'll get to that just a little bit later when we talk about Revelation. To me, there's a companion verse that I've set forth here that goes with 2 Corinthians 5. And it's John 14:2. And John says, and Jesus is speaking, in my Father's house are many rooms. And in some translations, it says mansions. If that were not so, I would have told you, because I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I am coming again, will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you will be also. There are those who interpret John 14:2, as he says, in my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. And so that might be interpreted as a body, as opposed to a habitation. So there is more than one way to look at that. But God has anticipated everything that's going to happen. He is prepared for us. And this is something that I find personally very exciting, that God, who is infinitely imaginative, who envisioned and spoke into being the entire universe, the parts of it we know and the parts of it we don't yet know, that God is going to be preparing a dwelling place for each one of us. How awesome that's going to be. And I do believe that each one of our dwelling places will be different. I don't think heaven is a homogeneous experience where everyone has exactly the same experiences there. We know that there are treasures that are based on the types of things that you did with your earthly opportunities. And we know that there are other things that would appear to be individualistic. I do believe that we'll know all of our friends and family, loved ones that will be with us in heaven. And I do believe we'll be able to interact with them in meaningful ways. We will not be in the same relationships that we were on earth. So in other words, if you're a parent and you have a child and the child's a young child, you might think of them and, oh, I am their parent. That is my status with them. Well, they'll come into their own being. You'll still be their mom or dad, but it won't have the same meaning that it did here on earth. If you're married, you will still have that knowledge of each other, that love for each other. But I don't believe that it will be the same in heaven as it is on earth. They'll be like angels in heaven who don't marry, where Jesus is speaking now, and he says, this is to the Pharisees who talked about the woman who had 7 brothers as husbands, and then she passed away, and then whose wife will she be? And he said, you don't understand how it works in heaven. And so this is another one of those mysteries that we have to trust God for. Obviously, if you have a wonderful relationship with someone, you want the best parts of that relationship to be forever. And I believe that they are. It just is not going to be in the same format as it is here on earth, because everything changes. You're going to change. Every one of us has experiences on earth that mar our earthly existence. We have suffering, we have wrongs, we have pain, things that we wish were different. When we go to heaven, all of that is going to be freed from us. Now, I'm not saying that your memories are going to be expunged. No, I believe what that means is you're going to be emotionally released from whatever pain you've had to experience in this life. And I know that because God tells us in Revelation. And for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with this, this is a rather shocking concept. When the end times come, and that's a whole separate discussion, and there are different views on that that are well within the realm of Christian orthodoxy. But whenever that is, we know how the story of mankind ends. And the earth is destroyed. And we see in Revelation 21, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. So the new earth that God will form is not going to look anything like the earth that we know today. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among the people. Tabernacle is a dwelling place. And he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. Now, this is the wonder of God's promise to us. Not only is he going to give you a glorified body that will no longer experience pain, but all of the memories of pain that you have from this earthly life that pain will be taken from you. You will never cry in heaven. You will never be sorrowful in heaven. Now, how God does this, I don't have the tools. I don't have the words to be able to understand it or explain it. But this is what God tells us will be. And I'm delighted that it's so, because how could it be heaven if you were spending all of eternity dwelling on the things that went wrong in your earthly life? And so God will create for us a marvelous new kind of existence. We won't forget who we were and the people that we love, but the things that hurt us, that cause us pain, will no longer cause us pain. Now, I've tried to imagine what it will be like in heaven and what we'll be doing in heaven. And there's probably a popular misconception that talks about, oh, there are a lot of people sitting around and playing harps and lounging on clouds, and there's really not much to do. Or other people might think of, well, it's just one continual worship service that goes on forever and ever and ever. Here's how I envision it, and what I'm about to tell you is not in the Bible. This is the product of my trying to understand what it might be like. In this physical world, we have many needs. We have a need to eat, to drink, to breathe oxygen. We have a need for temperature control. We have a need for protection from certain things like radiation. There are many, 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 many different requirements that we have. And that's just to stay alive. That says nothing about us being happy or fulfilled. In order for us to be fulfilled, so many other things have to be present. There are just a whole lot of requirements for us to be happy in this life. I imagine heaven as a place where you are now fully a spiritual being. You are a spiritual being now, but it's in a limited sense. You were given that spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing your inheritance. You're going to come into the fullness of what it means to be a spiritual being. And I believe that the needs of a spiritual being are one. All of the different things that we had, the many different needs we had on earth, they're all compressed into one. And that need is for God. A spiritual being receives everything. It says in Revelation, there's no longer a need for the sun because God's light will provide all of the light that we would need. And in my mind, that's a picture of it all. That God is going to so utterly fulfill us as spiritual beings, that being with him is going to utterly, completely fulfill us in a way that was just not even woefully possible on earth. So any concept we have of what it's like to be ultimately fulfilled and filled with joy is just a very, very small sampling of the reality that we'll experience when we as spiritual beings are filled to the uttermost by being in the presence of God. Because God is going to dwell amongst us and we're going to see him face to face. And that's unlike anything that this world could prepare us for. And so we know, because scripture tells us, that we will be active. We will be serving him in different ways. And I believe he made us with different gifts, different personalities, different proclivities, because he's going to have different things for us to do. I have no idea what they are. What could God in heaven desire for me to be doing for him that would be for all of eternity? And the best analogy I can come up with is, think how varied the universe is. He spoke that into being, and it was. There's no limit to the capacity of God to create things for us to do that will be a fulfillment of who he made us to be.
Will we have free will in heaven?
That's a great question. My answer is not one that is expressly given in the Bible. I have to infer this answer. We will not have free will in the same way that we have free will today. How do I know that? Because there is no sin in heaven. And so our capacity to sin or to sorrow, there's not going to be any tears. There are a lot of things that we have the capacity to do right now that we won't have the capacity to do in heaven. Now, thank goodness, all of those things are the bad stuff. The good stuff we're still going to be able to do. I do believe that we will have free will in heaven, but it's just not going to be the same kind of free will that we have here in this life. I promised a friend of mine that I would do the math, and I can tell you the size of the new Jerusalem. It is better than 3 billion cubic miles. So this is just something of unimaginable size. There would be plenty of room for everyone to have a whole kingdom in if God wanted to do that. Now, I know that his presence, the water of life flows through from the throne of God down the middle of the great street of the city. And so we have this imagery of it being concentrated. And so I don't know that we're going to be very dispersed, but whether or not we are all together at every moment, or whether or not God has us doing different things at different times, that only he knows. But we do know from Revelation 22 that we are going to dwell physically on this new earth in a city called New Jerusalem, which will be over 3 billion cubic miles in size.
My pastor took a trip to North Carolina to the Billy Graham Museum, and at one of the monuments or whatever, Billy Graham's last words or whatever, and now I'm going to home to be in heaven with the Lord forever. But that's not quite true if we're coming back to live with him on earth.
There's no contradiction. And here's why. What is heaven? Heaven is where God dwells. And right now, God is in the third heaven as it's described in Scripture. That's going to change. God is going to come and physically dwell with us forever in the New Jerusalem. And it would be completely consistent to say, I'm going to heaven where I'm going to be with God forever, because when God comes to the New Jerusalem, all of us will be there with him. So there will be no separation. Once you go to be with God, you will be with God forever. Where God is going to change. And therefore, where you're going to be is going to change. But so many things will be changing. Like I said, it is going to be a completely otherly experience compared to anything we've experienced here. I think most people's conception of heaven is very simplistic. They think of, well, in heaven, I'm going to get everything I want. Well, boy, I sure hope not, because I don't know what to want. I have no way of knowing what I should wish for in the reality that is yet to come. And I trust God that he would do a far better job of preparing whatever it's going to be for me that I could possibly do for myself.
Will our pets go to heaven?
Oh, good question. I'm glad you asked that one. Here's my understanding. The first thing is, when I consider what heaven is right now, there are animals there. And if there are horses in heaven, well, why wouldn't there be other animals? So that's one thing. A second thing that I'd look at is the fact that, well, the earth wasn't made as a habitation for man alone. Man was the ultimate, the final act of creation in that creation week. But God spent a good part of his time creating earth the first time around to have all different variety of life. And I don't see any reason why a new earth wouldn't have that life. Pet is a physical creature, but it's not just a physical creature. In other words, a pet isn't just a collection of atoms. A pet is a creature that has a soul. Now, soul is a term that's used a great deal in Scripture, And it's difficult to understand because there are places where soul and spirit seem to be used interchangeably, and yet they do have, in my mind, distinct meanings. The way I understand a soul is a combination of a mind which thinks, emotions that feel, and a will that chooses. And if you think of any pet you've ever had that you've grown attached to, it probably had all three of those capabilities. I think of Chuck right now. He absolutely has a will. We get to see the will every day. We also get to see his emotions. And most days, we get to see him thinking about stuff and trying to figure something out. Or it's obvious that while he doesn't have a human level of intelligence, I think it's estimated that dogs probably have the intellectual capability of very young children. So I don't see any reason that Chuck's soul would be forever snuffed out. In other words, he has a soul and I have a soul. Now, I also have a spirit. That's what distinguishes me from a dog, is that I have something that is qualitatively different from him. Not just that I'm smarter or I make better use of my thumbs. There's something there's an ingredient to a human being that none of the animals have. And my soul will last forever. Why wouldn't Chuck's?
I always wonder why we don't have a clear view of heaven, or, we have his word and what his word says about it. But he doesn't want us to know everything, because if we didn't know everything, the hope would not be there. What is hope? Hope is that expectation, that desire for a certain thing to happen or envision. So he wants us to have that hope of heaven. If he gave us all the answers, we'd already know it, and that hope wouldn't be there, at least for me anyway. So
the word that came into my mind as you were talking, Myrna, was longing. We know enough to long for it. We don't know the details, but he has given us certainly more than enough for us to be able to have this desire. I mean, you can hear that desire in Paul saying, that I would wish that I could just be with God right now, but it's better for you that I stay in this earthly tent because there's work yet for me to do here. But I would rather be deceased from this world and with God by far than
Amen.
be here. And so there's this longing, and there are other places where it talks about our citizenship is in heaven. We are aliens here. We are strangers, foreigners in this world where we are the enemy of the world system. But we are citizens. If you think about what being a citizen meant back in the days of Rome, if you were a citizen, you had all these rights that elevated you above the rest of the ordinary people. Well, you are a citizen of heaven, even though right now you're living in a place where you're an alien. But you will come home to your true home, which is with God. And there you're going to be not just a citizen, but a son or a daughter. And that is the place of honor that you have prepared for you. So when you look at all the rotten stuff that happens here, and I've preached sermons before on why bad things happen in this world, and the short answer is, well, earth is where bad things happen. Pure and simple. This is the place that bad things happen. And we shouldn't be surprised when earth is earth-like. That's what it is. It is a cursed place. But that's not our future. Our future is to be lifted out of that. And God makes everything new. We are new creations when we're born again. The earth is going to be born again. The heavens are going to be born again. Jerusalem is going to be born again. It's all going to be made new. And this time it's going to be God's perfect plan instead of man's plan that messed it all up.